Well, good morning, church. How's everyone today? It is a blessing to be here with all of you this morning. How many of you have ever felt like you were stuck in a moment in time? Like you could relive the actual moment over and over and over again? You guys have those moments in your life? Like where you know what day it was, what time it was, what the weather was like. There's an entire generation that could tell you exactly where they were when they heard about JFK or Elvis, right? Like there's moments that are just etched into our psyche, and we'll remember everything about them, because traumatic events tend to stick, don't they? They tend to kind of stick with us for a long time. One of those moments for me was a number of years ago. My daughter was, she was 4 or 5 years old. I was picking her up from preschool, and it was a Wednesday on a beautiful, warm Southern California spring day. And I walked down, and I grabbed my little girl by the hand, and we're walking back to the car, and she lets out this shriek that it was just crazy. It was this sound I'd never heard. She throws her little backpack down on the ground. She starts tearing through it. She grabs a piece of paper and just takes off running. And I'm like, did she forget she had like the nuclear launch codes? Like what exactly is going on here? Did she forget to turn in some homework? Like what happened? And I see her run over to these group of kids, and then she comes strolling nonchalantly back. And I was like, okay. So now I'm curious, right? And I'm like, baby girl, what did you do? She goes, I had to go give him something. I was like, what did you give that little boy? She's like, my phone number. Y'all, I thought I had more time. She was 4 years old. You know what I mean? Like, I thought I had a little bit of time. You guys, at 4, I knew I was in trouble. You know what I mean? I was like, I need to pray a whole heck of a lot, right? Because here's the thing. Men, we're protectors, aren't we? By nature, we're protectors, especially of our daughters, right? And even at 4 years old, you want to protect them from having a broken heart. And more importantly, you want to protect them from boys because you were one, right? And we want to protect them from all that stuff. We want to make sure they're not hurt. We want to make sure they don't have harm. We want to make sure that we protect them from life and from injustice. It's kind of hardwired into who we are as people. But for the last few weeks, we've been in the book of Ruth, and what we find is that Ruth and Naomi, they have nobody to protect them. They have nobody left to come alongside and to ensure that they're protected, right? We found out in chapter 1 that Ruth's husband, her brother-in-law, and her father-in-law all have died, right? Her family and her security in the culture of the time was completely devastated and lost. She and her mother-in-law were completely left alone, which isn't a good thing in general, but it's even worse given the period of time that it happened. Remember, this is the time of the judges, right? When people did what was right in their own eyes, they could take anything they wanted. They could do anything they wanted. The law, it was kind of like the Wild West of ancient Israel. It's this awful lawless time in history. And what we find is we drop into the story of Ruth is there are two women who are barely clinging on to hope and clinging on to survival. And last week, Lena covered the fact that according to Jewish law, the poor could go out in the fields after the harvesters went through, and they could pick up the leftovers. It's called gleaning, right? And so what we find is that Ruth, she's been encouraged by her mother-in-law, Naomi, to go out and glean the fields, to pick up the stuff the harvesters miss. And it's in Jewish law. This is the right of the poor. And so she goes out there, and she's gleaning, and she's off to work, and she meets a man named Boaz. And you guys remember, this is Lena's version of Boaz. I don't know. I have questions, but I thought it would be me, but no, it's Harrison Ford, all right? And there's Boaz, and she meets him, and she introduces herself, and if you read the story, he responds immediately. He says, I know who you are. Yeah, I've heard about you. It seems that maybe he's done a little recon, maybe he knew, someone who knew something about her, but he knows that there's a single girl working in his field, and he said, yeah, I've heard about you. I know who you are. Go ahead and go back to work in my field. Then he goes to his guys and he says this. He's like, hey guys, drop some of the good stuff. Like, instead of taking everything, instead of just leaving the bare minimum behind for the poor, can you guys leave her some of the better stuff? Leave her some of the easy stuff to find so she doesn't have to work quite as hard. We don't want to just leave her leftovers. We want to give her some of the good stuff. And we don't know if maybe Boaz was smitten a little bit right? If Boaz was like trying to impress her, we don't really know. We don't know if he had just had compassion for her. It's really not clear. But what we do know is that he let her continue to work in his fields, not just during the barley harvest, but during the wheat harvest as well. So for an entire season, she's gleaning from his field. And we also know that he knows exactly who she is. So all this time, as she's working the field, Boaz has an opportunity to watch her. He watches her work. He watches her live. And it's not the creepy kind of watching, right? It's not that. But he watches her and he has an opportunity to see her at work. And before we go on, we need to mention something that Lena talked about last week. Boaz is considered one of Ruth's family redeemers. In ancient times, if a man died without an heir, it was the responsibility. Now, it wasn't the opportunity, it wasn't the option. It was the responsibility of the brother to provide them an heir. Does that make sense? So to marry his brother's wife and provide an heir for them. And that child that he would have with his brother's wife would not be considered his, it would be considered his brother's. Does that make sense? So his brother's line would continue. His brother's house would continue through that child that came from that wedding, right? From that marriage. And so it would have carried on the family's name, the father's estate. But she had a husband whose father died, who would have carried on Elimelech's estate. But then the brother died. And then the other brother died. So there's nobody left to carry on this family's birthright. And that's where Boaz comes in. Now, Boaz was not Elimelech's brother. Okay? He was a distant relative of Elimelech. And he had no duty at all to marry Naomi, to marry Ruth, to redeem Elimelech's family line. In fact, it was really, really risky for Elimelech, and for Boaz, and we're going to get to the why in just a moment. He had the option to marry one of them if he wanted to, if the opportunity presented itself. He could redeem the family line if he really thought it was in his best interest. If he wanted to, he could marry one of the women, he could have a child. But remember, if he had a child with one of them, it would carry on the name of Elimelech. It would not carry on the name of Boaz, right? And this is where things get complicated, because if it was going to carry on the name of Elimelech, if they didn't have another male heir and Boaz died, all of Boaz's estate would belong to Elimelech's house. Does that make sense? Elimelech would gain, his whole house would gain everything. Boaz could lose absolutely everything. So it's not that he just had the option to do it. It's super, super risky for him to do it, right? His whole family, his extended family, whoever he would will things to, would lose everything because this child would become the heir to his estate. Does that make sense? So if he didn't have another male heir, it would go to the estate of Elimelech, because the first male belongs to the redeemed family, right? So if the Redeemer didn't have another child, another heir, a son, his family would die. It would just cease to exist, much like what we saw with Elimelech. So Boaz had zero zilch. He had no requirements to become a family redeemer. Like I said, in fact, it's really risky to do so. In fact, you kind of have to have some serious skin in the game. There's got to be something really in it for you to become a family redeemer usually. But he had the option. He could do it if he wanted to. He was a candidate, and he'd been generous so far, and that had not been lost on Naomi, Ruth's mother-in-law, right? Ruth's mother-in-law's, how many guys at one point in time, you had a mom or somebody that was trying to always marry you off, right? You guys know what I'm talking about. So this is Naomi. She's like, hey, have you seen Boaz, right? Like he's got some stuff. Like he's got some wealth, right? He's been so nice to you. In fact, she says this in chapter 3. She says, my daughter, it's time I found a permanent home for you so that you'll be provided for. In other words, it's time that we don't live together. It's time that you go get married. It's time that you find a husband. It's time that you go out on your own and you start making a life. She says, you need a man. You need the security that comes with a marriage. This isn't the life you should be living. And if we remember the story, this is huge for Naomi, because up till recently, she's only been focused on what she's lost, right? Remember, Naomi means sweet. And she says, don't call me sweet. Call me Mara. Call me bitter. Don't call me sweetheart. Call me bitter old woman, because that's what I am, because God has taken everything from me. All she's been focused on is her misery and her hurt. But she seems to see maybe there's an opportunity here for God to do something. She says, so have you noticed Boaz? Isn't he nice? Isn't he generous? He has land. He has money. He has a ship that can do the Kessel run in 12 parsecs, right? Like, shameless Star Wars joke. If you guys don't know it, it's fine. Just move on. Just move on. Then Naomi gives Ruth some advice that no dad on the planet would ever give their daughter. She says this, "Now do as I tell you. Take a bath and put on perfume and dress in your nicest clothes. Then go to the threshing floor, but don't let Boaz see you until he's finished eating and drinking. Be sure to notice where he lies down. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down there. He will tell you what to do." I read that and I was like, there is no way. There's no way. Like, it's obvious there's a guy not around. Naomi's saying, look, this guy is single. He can redeem our family. He's a catch. I don't know if he's interested. You don't know if he's interested, but there's a way to find out, right? There's a way to find out. And this is what I want you to do. I want you to get dressed up. I want you to take a shower. I want you to put on some deodorant, let your hair down a little bit, and I want you to go on down to the threshing floor. And I want you to watch the boys. And they've worked all day, but now they're eating and they're drinking. And why are the boys eating and drinking? Because they just had this huge harvest, right? Just a few years before, Judah was a desolation. Judah had nothing. Judah was in famine, but now there's plenty. God's provided, and they made it through the worst of all, and there's grain everywhere. And these men are celebrating. And some people think, oh man, they were celebrating so hard, they just end up sleeping out there, right? But that's not what happened, right? It's not. What happened is, this is the time of the judges, when people did what was right in their own eyes. And so after the men worked so hard all day on their harvest, not just gathering the grain, but then threshing it on the threshing floor, they would curl up around the pile of the stuff that they were able to harvest to protect it so that nobody could come along in the night and steal it, right? So they would sleep around their harvest in a way to protect it. I mean, there's no cyclone fences, there's no guard dogs, there's no big concrete silos to put stuff in. So they are there to protect it until they can find a place for it, right? So they make sure that it was secure until it was time to divvy up the harvest. So Naomi says, watch Boaz. And when he falls asleep, I want you to sneak down to the foot of his bed and just lie there. And when he wakes up, he will tell you what to do. Every dad with a daughter was like, over my dead body, right? Like, look, we don't even live during the time of the judges, and there's no way I'd ever tell my daughter, sneak into his room to the foot of the bed, and whatever he tells you to do it. There's no way. There's no way in a million years we would ever tell this to a woman. But Naomi understands something that we often don't understand, and she understands something because I think she saw God doing something. And sometimes when God is moving in a relationship, there's something you and I that we really need to be confronted with, and sometimes we don't like it, and that's this. Real relationships require risk. If you want to go deeper, if you want to go further, it takes risk in a relationship. You can't have a surface level marriage and that marriage last. You can't have a surface level friendship and it go deep. If you want to go deep, if you want to go far with someone, you have to have risk, right? That's part of it. You got to be vulnerable. And Boaz, he notices her. He seems to like her. She's a hard worker. But it was just transactional. She can work in my field, right? And so at this point, there was no risk. But Naomi is telling Ruth, I want you to risk it. I want you to go down there, and I want you to see Boaz. Listen, unless you're in Vegas, you don't wake up married one day, right? It takes a lot of work. Like it takes time and energy and effort. You have to build relationship with someone else before you can go all the way in, right? So Ruth listens to Naomi. She does what she's told. She scrubs off the field gunk. She throws on a nice dress, and she heads on down to where the men are asleep, and she lays down at Boaz's feet. And this is what happens next. Around midnight, Boaz suddenly woke up and turned over. He is surprised to find a woman lying at his feet. Who are you? He asked. Boaz was kind of freaked out. I don't know about you, but I would be too if I woke up and there's a woman who uncovered my feet, sleeping there, right? He's half asleep. He's like, what on earth is going on? And apparently, Ruth cleans up so well, he doesn't even recognize her, right? He's like, who are you? And Ruth says, and I'm going to explain this because it's absolutely beautiful, and we can read the story of Ruth, and we can gloss right over it because we don't have an understanding of what's actually being said. She says this. She said, I'm your servant, Ruth. Spread the corner of your covering over me, for you are my family redeemer. So beautiful. But when you understand the original language and what's happening here, there's such a deep and amazing statement that's being made. If you remember last week, Lena went over in Ruth 2, Boaz prayed a prayer for Ruth. He said, may the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge, reward you fully for what you've done. And the word for wings and the word for garment here are the exact same in the Hebrew language. So in the same way that Boaz prayed that God would spread his wings of protection over her, she says, it's your job. I'm asking you to be the one that comes alongside and spreads your wings of protection over me. In essence, Ruth is proposing marriage, which is kind of gutsy, right? They've only had a surface level relationship. She's saying, you can do this. You can redeem my family. Sometimes relationships require risk. She's putting herself out there. And this is the time of the judges. I mean, again, lawlessness. Naomi tells Ruth, do whatever the boy tells you to do, right? That's not great advice. How many of you know someone who is one way in public but a different way in private? Right? She only knows the public version of Boaz. She doesn't know what he's like behind closed doors, right? No guy on the planet would be like, I trust him. Just do whatever he tells you to do, right? Naomi didn't know Boaz that well. He might have had a reputation. He could have taken advantage of Ruth, right? She's alone out in a field. Lucky for them, though, Boaz was a man of outstanding character. And Ruth says, you have the ability. You have the ability to redeem my family. You have the ability to come alongside all that has happened and redeem it all, to redeem that whole story. Listen, was that Ruth's duty? No. Ruth owes this family nothing. She has no blood relation at all. But remember, she told Naomi, your people are now my people, and your God is now my God. In other words, we are now connected. We are family. There is no distinction. Right? And so she's coming along and she's saying, listen, this is what's going to happen now. I am going to become your family. She had absolutely no requirement to do this, right? She had no ties to Elimelech. She was his daughter by marriage. Naomi's her mother-in-law, right? And Boaz, he knows this. And look at how he responds. He says in verse 10, the Lord bless you, my daughter. You are showing even more family loyalty now than you did before. See, sometimes we miss stuff in the story. We read it, and we don't realize how it's all connected, how it's all building on each other. You are showing even more family loyalty than you did before. For now, you have not gone after a younger man, whether rich or poor. Now, don't worry about a thing, my daughter. I will do what is necessary, for everyone in town knows that you are a virtuous woman. Boaz is blown away by Ruth's commitment. Here we have a Moabite woman who owes this Jewish family nothing. She has no true family connection, and she's doing everything in her power to try to redeem this story, this family. And Boaz says, what loyalty to this family you have. You could have left back to Moab, but you didn't. You could have moved out of that house from that bitter woman, but you didn't. You could have found a younger man, but you haven't. Here you are. He's saying, you're stayed true to the commitment that you made, not just to Naomi, but to his family and to their God. And listen, everyone knows you're a catch, but there's a problem. And he drops a little bit of a bomb on Ruth here. And Ruth may not have understood all the laws and customs of the Jewish people. Remember, she's a Moabite. She was raised in a different culture. So it's likely she didn't understand. And this might have discouraged her a bit, but he says this in verse 12. He says, while it's true that I am one of your family redeemers, there's another man who's more closely related to you than I am. Stay here tonight, and in the morning I'll talk to him. If he is willing to redeem you, very well, let him marry you. But if he's not willing, then as surely as the Lord lives, I will redeem you myself. Now lie down here until morning. So what he's saying is that, listen, I am one of your family redeemers. This is something I absolutely can do. But here's the thing. There's someone who's closer in relation to Elimelech that has the right of first refusal to marry you, right? That's how it works. Like, I can't just jump the line here. Like, I can't just make this happen. So I've got to go talk to this guy, right? He says, but look, I'm going to go talk to him tomorrow. And if he wants to redeem your family, there's nothing I can do about it. Remember, there's a lot of risk, right? There's a lot of risk to Boaz. He's now saying, I'm willing to put even more risk into this. I'm going to go talk to this guy, right? And if he's not willing to do it, then I promise I will be the one to do it. So Boaz, he's trying to be the protector. He's not making hasty decisions like Naomi. He says, okay, so stay here tonight and sleep at my feet. How is that Boaz being a protector? Again, time of the judges, lawlessness. He knows the middle of the night, a foreign single woman on a road is not a place for her. And so he says, lay here and leave in the morning. There's nothing sexual about this. She's a virtuous woman, and he's a man of character. And the story continues in verse 14. So Ruth lay at Boaz's feet until morning. But she got up before it was light enough for people to recognize each other. For Boaz has said, no one must know that a woman was here at the threshing floor. Why is that a big deal if no one did anything wrong? Let's just put it in a modern context. You're getting up first thing in the morning, pour yourself a cup of coffee, look out your front door, and there's someone sneaking out of your neighbor's house who doesn't live there. And their hair's all a mess, and they're wearing a dress that you don't wear in the morning. You're going to have some questions, right? And they know that people talk. And Boaz knows this. If it gets back to this person that he needs to meet with first, it's going to complicate this whole problem. It's going to complicate this whole thing. If he doesn't follow the law, then Boaz is in a heap of trouble. So he knows, we've got to get this right. But relationships require risk. And he's willing to risk it, right? He's willing to go forward with this. He's willing to go to a point, to an extent. He's protecting them both. And as soon as it's safe for her to leave, he sends her on her way. But before she leaves, Boaz does this. He says, bring your cloak and spread it out. He measured 6 scoops of barley, put it into the cloak, placed it on her back. Then he returned to town. When Ruth went back to her mother-in-law, Naomi asked, what happened, my daughter? Ruth told Naomi everything Boaz had done for her. And she added, he gave me these 6 scoops of barley and said, don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed. Then Naomi said to her, just be patient. Wait until we hear what happens. The man won't rest until he has settled things today. If you haven't made the connection, if you've never thought about it before, what's happening in the story of Ruth happens again in the New Testament. Jesus is our Boaz. He comes into a story where he has all the risk. He has no reason. He has no requirement to enter our story and take on our mess. He has no obligation to redeem us, but he does it. And so if you don't ever realize there's this Old Testament Jesus through Boaz, and it could easily be called the book of Boaz, but I think it's a terrible name, so they went with Ruth, right? So we have this story, and it's all about foreshadowing what our Savior is going to do for us, the way he redeems us, the way he enters our story, and he changes the entirety of it. See, the risk is all his, it's not ours. And at the end of this chapter, what we see is Naomi talking to Ruth, and she says, just wait. You put yourself out there. Now I want you to wait. He's working on it. Just wait. How many of you have ever been there with God? Where you've put it out there and you just have to wait. And you have no idea what the solution's going to be. You have no idea what it's all going to look like. You just have to trust that he's at work. How many of you guys have been there? How many of you guys, let's be honest, right now, how many of you are there right now? Right now you're like, I'm just waiting. Like I've thrown it out there and I'm like, Lord, I don't know what's going on. But I know you're in the waiting. I know you're doing stuff. I know you're active. I just wish you would tell me what was going on, right? Listen, it's so difficult sometimes to rely on someone else. And here we have a Redeemer that's gone before us, that's taken all the risk, and we throw our requests on him. And we just have to wait. See, it's hard in the waiting when we don't know the outcome. But just like Naomi's advice to Ruth, my advice to you would be the man won't rest until it's complete. He's going to be at work. He's going to keep doing things. He's going to keep working for you on your behalf. And it may not look the way you want, but he's at work. And I think there are a lot of people who are out there who have said, they made their requests known to their Boaz, to Jesus, and they're like, Lord, this is what I need. And he's at work. But we're impatient. He's at work, but we're like, where are you? It's difficult. It's difficult in the waiting. See, because he's redeeming not just us, he's redeeming our family names. He's redeeming our futures. He's changing everything about who we are and who we're becoming. And we get to choose who we're going to be in the story, folks. Are we going to be Naomi? Sweet until we become bitter? Are we sweet until things don't go our way, sometimes tragically so, and we get angry and just live in that anger? Are we going to be Ruth, who seems to have a life's mission to serve the people around them? Are we going to be Boaz, people looking to redeem other people's stories? See, the truth is, we're called to be the light of the world. We're called to reflect God and his goodness on earth. Does God come through without us? Yes and amen. But church, listen, sometimes we get to be Boaz. Sometimes we get to help other people redeem their stories. And just like Boaz, can I just tell you, the risk is all ours. Sometimes we wait for God to make it easy for us to enter in and redeem someone's story. That's not how it works. Real relationship requires risk. And if you want to go deeper, if you want to help somebody in their felt need, not in just their practical need, listen, anybody on the planet, non-Christians can buy someone food. That doesn't make you like Jesus. Entering their story and helping redeem it does. But to enter someone's story with any kind of real meaning means you've got to take all the risk. You've got to do all the work. But we don't like that. We like it easy. We like a simple entry. And when they're ungrateful, we go, well, then I'm not going to do it anymore. Y'all, let me just ask you a question. How many of you have been ungrateful for something God's done? Yeah, he does it again and again and again, despite us. We are the most fickle Boazes on the planet. Listen, you don't get to redeem when it's convenient. You redeem when there's a need and you can meet it. Moms and dads, if your parents weren't Christ followers, if they were deadbeats, if they were hurtful, hateful, they were addicts, right? You get to be Boaz to your family, to your kids. They don't ever have to experience what it is you experience. You get to redeem your family. Your kids will never have to experience and see what it is you had to see. And you don't get to just redeem their story. You get to redeem their kids' story and their kids' kids' story. And can I just tell you, doing this is rarely without risk. But it's always worth it. See, sometimes we have to rely on the fact that what God has called us to is bigger than our discomfort. What God has called us to is bigger than our frustration. What God has called us to is bigger than our drama. By the way, there's plenty. What God has called us to is to be redeemers. See, because that's what Christians mean. It means little Christ. That's what it means, right? That's what we're called to. We're called to redeem like Christ has redeemed. What is God calling you to redeem? What is he calling you to do? How is he calling you to be Boaz to the Ruths all around you? And you might be thinking, well, that's great, but I'm not sure I want to get married right now to fix someone else's problems. That's not the moral of the story, right? What the story is telling us is we have to put ourselves out there. We have to risk hurt and rejection and frustration. We are the ones that put on the risk. It's entering the story that God has for us, realizing we have a part to play in its redemption. I've heard over and over the image of marriage being used for what's happening in this church right now. Two churches coming together. We have a part to play in that. We could be Naomi, who becomes Mara. We could be Ruth and try to serve. We could be Boaz and try to redeem the story. Who is it that we're going to be known for? Listen, not just in this merge, but in this church, in this valley, what part are we going to play to what God is doing in and through our lives? How are you stepping out, being a mini Jesus everywhere you go? That is our calling. It's not comfort. It's not a food pantry. Those are great. How are you redeeming the stories of the people all around you? Can I just tell you, if the church understood the need to be a Boaz, it would change the face of the church. And I'm not talking about this church. I'm talking about the capital C church. I would venture to say that most people in the world know what the church is against, not what the church is for. We are about redemption. We are about bringing together. We are about Christ being glorified and magnified in this story. And sometimes that means we don't get what we want. And sometimes it means it doesn't go our way. And sometimes that means we have to be the first one to take the step to bury the hatchet. Sometimes that means that we have to say we're sorry when we really weren't the ones that caused it. Sometimes it takes us being the one taking that first step, being the one that understands that the risk is all ours. But that's what we're called to, amen? We're called to be risk takers, reflecting Jesus in all that we do. Will you stand with me so we can pray? Lord, real relationships require risk. And whether it's a church merger or it's at work, Lord, whether it's in families, whether it's in casual connections that you're calling us to go deeper in, Lord, real relationships require risk. And as Christians, we can lean into, oh, I'm an introvert, or oh, I'm just too busy. We can lean into all the excuses that keep us from being who you call us to be, which is redeemers in your name. God, you have not called anyone to being right. You've called us to being righteous in you. Lord, it's not about winning an argument. It's about reflecting your glory. Jesus, in all that we do, in the life that we live, in the relationships that we've developed, would we be Boaz, Lord? It's good to be Ruth. It's good to serve. But Lord, would we be able to step back and see where it is we can redeem in the stories of those around us? God, it's too easy. It's too easy to say the risk is too great. It's too easy to say I don't have time. It's too easy to make excuses for why we can't step out. But Lord, you've called us to risk just like you have risked. So may we be those people, reflecting your glory in all that we do. In your name, amen.